So, guys, Freddie's left us because he had some work to do. But right now, we're also going to be talking about the dark side of the IPL or the 2020 game in particular. And since we're talking dark side, we got a dark personality and Siddhant Ani joining us on the show for his whatever expert analysis on this. But let's talk to you, Tim, first and foremost. While there is the good of what's happening on the field, and the economy is booming, the cricket economy is booming, courtesy of the 2020 game. There is a dark side to it as well, fixing, doping, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways, just the popularity of T20 has created all these problems. I mean, most simple, we have so many matches played. So every year now we have over 700 games of T20 played around the world, and almost all these games they're all televised or live streamed, and you can bet on them. And basically, if you can bet on them, there's a possibility of corruption. And although we've seen some corruption in the IPL, the biggest worry anti-corruption bodies have it's lower leagues and lower levels of international cricket where the players might not be paid a lot, and you still have huge amounts of money bet. So we for example, we think that the Afghan Premier League, there might be $600 million US bet on every match, which is an incredible amount, and that's around the world. And the vast majority of that money is with illegal bookmakers, and it's very, very hard to trace. But we know from what's bet on through legal means, it's likely to be in the region of $500-600 million US. And the point is, therefore, players in that league who are paid the least, they could be very vulnerable because they might think, I might only play a few matches of this league ever. I might be out of a job, in literally a few weeks' time. So and it might be like, well, I probably would have failed anyway. I probably would have got under 10 runs anyway. So if someone offers you money to guarantee to get under 10 runs, you can see why that's very tempting. And we see the level of anti-corruption education around the world. It's a bit haphazard. It's not as good as it should be. So there's a need to do a lot more to safeguard the integrity of the game. Otherwise, we will, there's already almost every league has had problems. We've had problems in the IPL, the T20 Blast, in the Pakistan Super League as well, in the Bangladesh Premier League. So, and that's just what we know. So there is the fear that's sort of the tip of the iceberg, and more needs to be done, to control things. Otherwise, we could have a situation almost like cricket in the 1990s again.
And Tim, these leagues are going to keep popping up, right? Because if one thing administrators have learned, it's these small leagues come in, quickly play a few games and get out, and that's what works economically from an administrator or an organizer's point of view.
Well, no, this is the interesting thing is that actually a lot of leagues, we looked really deep, and a lot of leagues are not making money. It took the IPL 5, 6, 7, 8 years for teams to be sure of making money. And in fact, it was only really the bumper new deal, which began at the end of 2017, that meant all teams were safely in profit. So a lot of these leagues, they tend to overestimate the number of Indian viewers they'll get. So we saw, for example, this global T20 league in South Africa, that was predicated partly on having loads of Indian viewers. So they had 3 Indian owners, and they thought Indian cricket fans would watch because of Indian owners, and they realised that was not going to happen. So the league went bust before it even started. So actually we see it's a bit of a kind of a wild west of leagues, is what people say. So you have, in this mad scramble to create leagues, leagues are spending more than they can afford, and then these leagues get into big trouble. And of course that feeds into fixing as well, because if you're a player and you sense something is not all right. So we saw, in the Canada League last year, there was, players got on the team bus and they refused to get off because they hadn't been paid. This was, over halfway through the tournament. And so if you're in a league like that where you're worried you might not get paid from the league, clearly then you might be more vulnerable to match fixing, because all the evidence on match fixing, well, it says a couple of things. It says when you play in matches which have a large TV audience, lots of money that's bet around the world, and you're not paid very well, you'll be very vulnerable to fixing. And it also says if you're playing in a match when some of your teammates are paid a lot and you're paid very little, you'll be probably jealous and more inclined to fix. And that's true. A lot of leagues, you often get players, who are on a few $100,000 for the league, and some who are on very, very little indeed. So you have, your teammate might be earning 50 times as much money as you for the same amount of work. You wouldn't be human if you weren't jealous and a bit resentful in that situation.
But then, Tim, would I be jumping the gun and saying, so I'll flip the question, with a lot of these small obscure leagues coming around.
Just to add one quick point on this, we're talking here specifically about players, of course. But there are also sort of referees involved or umpires involved in the case of cricket, who are inevitably even paid far less than what the lowest earning player is playing is earning through the league. And Therefore, they get far fewer games, etc., and which also makes them susceptible in targets to influencing outcomes. I mean, especially in a game like cricket where the umpire has a literally ball by ball role to play, and technology comes in and all of that, of course. But yeah, just that much.
Yeah, umpires officials could be vulnerable. We've seen a big umpire fixing scandal in the NBA basketball league, and there's definitely a possibility of that in T20 leagues as well. So another reason to be vigilant. I mean, with DRS, so that makes it maybe a little bit harder, but there's still vulnerabilities there potentially.
Let me flip that question for you. All these obscure leagues that are popping up all over the world, and they keep coming every 2-3 years. And I'm not just saying about a country doing a league. I'm saying about local leagues, say domestic leagues that are happening within a country. Yeah. Would I be right in saying a lot of these leagues, like you mentioned, they're not making money? So then, are they solely being set up from the purpose of a fixing angle, or am I jumping the gun?
I need to be careful about what we say here. But what we do know, there was that league in the UAE, the Ajman All Stars, and basically that was set up explicitly to fix.
Is this the one where people are losing their wicket just for the sake of it?
Yeah, you might have seen this. Yeah. I mean, some of those stumpings. I mean, it's worse than me playing cricket. It's quite extraordinary, that ineptitude. But that's an extreme example. But I think there is that worry that, again, the vetting of the owners is not always as good as it should be, and that potentially you create a situation where owners buy a team, they realise they're losing loads of money. Well, they might think the only way to get their money back is to ensure their team loses and bet against their team. I mean, obviously we need to be careful about our words here, but there are big vulnerabilities there potentially.
So if I were to compare, say, an Ajman League over here with their practices as far as anti-corruption and doping is concerned, and then you have IPL, how far ahead is the IPL in terms of keeping those practices afloat?
Yeah, it's a different league altogether, but could there be more done? Yes, there could. And there's also, the IPL still has a big issue. What does it do the 10 months a year when there's not the IPL on? How much is it safeguarding players then? Because again, if you're a fringe local Indian player in the IPL and say you're in the 30s and you're not a brilliant player and you might think, every season could be your last. Well, there's every chance that, a few months before the IPL, you get approached and then you can make an agreement or something which is contingent upon you playing, and then you don't have any contact with them during the IPL when you'll be monitored more closely, and then afterwards, you might get your payment or whatever. So I think even
you're focusing on doping right now. Is that what you're pointing to?
No, that's talking about in match fixing.
Yeah.
You could be approached by corruptors, but it similarly applies to doping. You could dope outside the leagues. I think there's the cricket's anti-doping code is nowhere near as good as it should be. So the ICC's whereabouts testing, it only applies to the top 8 ODI nations at the moment, which even meant West Indies and Afghanistan in the World Cup. They were not part of that. They obviously have their own national anti-doping programs, and there's anti-doping testing in leagues as well. But I did the numbers for our book, and most leagues, they do a few dozen anti-doping tests in an entire league season, which means most players don't even get once. I mean, there is a big vulnerability, and we saw what happened in baseball sort of 15 years ago, where it was absolutely rife, and there's a concern that cricket is not doing enough to safeguard itself against doping this time as well. And because in the history of cricket, doping actually generally hasn't been that much of an advantage until T20. But with T20, clearly, if you can hit the ball another 5-10 meters from the same shot, that could put another zero on your paycheck come the IPL auction.
Tim, in one of the chapters of your book, Cricket 2.0, you guys have done a comparison as far as anti-doping tests and all are concerned. And you've done the comparison in Major League Baseball and I think the IPL. What's the number like?
We've done the comparison between Major League Baseball and all cricket around the world according to the ICC. So
you've taken international cricket as well?
All cricket, and local tests. So what we find, there was 27,000 tests in Major and Minor League Baseball combined, and in cricket around the world, only 1,400. So there's 19 times more tests in baseball in one country than in cricket throughout the world. And obviously, more people play cricket than baseball. A lot more people play cricket than baseball. So that's a huge vulnerability there potentially, because the value of steroids potentially for a T20 player is massive, because it means you can clear the ropes more, and you find you'll get more contracts in leagues around the world, and you'll be earning a lot more, having much better career. So there's a massive potential incentive to dope if the testing is not good enough.
From an administrator's point of view, is it burning a hole in your pocket to get these tests done, or is that the reason why they're not happening at a regular pace in cricket?
So there is obviously some testing done, but I think finances are always a barrier to doing more testing, especially what we find is the testing itself is not everything. So what you really need to catch dopers, you need intelligence, basically the intelligence community, and that does cost money, because you can be doing a lot of work just to catch a couple of people. And there is some good work being done, some very good work being done, but it probably is not nearly as well resourced as it should be. And there's also an unhealthy difference from country to country, which means that in some countries you could probably dope and there's always a chance of getting caught, of course, but your chances are pretty minuscule. And also, not every player, of course, reaches IPL Big Bash standards. So if you're on the kind of what I call the tier 2 or tier 3 circuit, so you're playing a bit in Bangladesh, you might play in Nepal, you might play in the Canada League, you can still make a good living, and the chances of being testing are pretty minuscule. So we found in some leagues, the Caribbean Premier League, they had 0 testing, big fat 0. I mean, that's shocking, really.
Yeah. So in a sense, I don't know what you think about it. The Andre Russell suspension, it seemed more like making a statement and doing some PR that here we are, we're doing it, because in your book you've written that post getting caught, he's gone and played a lot of cricket as well, and he's won quite a few titles.
Well, yeah, he's obviously a fantastic player, and I mean he's been given a ban and he's served it in full. So, from that point of view, there's nothing that's what's happened. But I think it's fair to say that what happened there is likely to be the tip of the iceberg in the T20 game more broadly. And we actually just see, just using our own eyes, we see the physique of batsmen is getting more and more every year. So you see even the build of sort of a Sachin Tendulkar, you do not really get that in. That's now very unusual in T20 cricket. The build of Andre Russell, those sorts of guys. The batsmen are getting taller, they're getting broader, and the potential. I mean, there's certainly potential there to benefit a lot from doping, and is enough being done to put people off doping? I would say no.
Annie, you want to add something, bro? Maybe not doping, but the conversations you've had with Mr. AKA Modi.
It's I don't know. We can get into it later on more specifically. I can pull out actual quotes and stuff. I don't want to say stuff in this context that's like even a little bit off. But no, I did have like a couple of questions for Tim. If you have a couple of minutes, like for example, are there any countries that within their at least national anti-doping establishment are more proactive in their cricket association? This might be associate nations like the Dutch, maybe, for example. I don't know. Who are doing a little more to sort of monitor and follow anti-doping code, and also consequently the fixing part as well.
No, I think it obviously it probably depends on the national governments and their priorities. So we find in general countries that are a bit wealthier, they tend to have more sophisticated programs on doping. We also find in countries where physical sports are more popular and there's been more of a prior history of doping, they do more testing. So, in Australia where you have Aussie rules, in New Zealand where you have obviously rugby union, in the UK to an extent as well, there's a decent history of doping, anti-doping tests in some parts of the subcontinent where there's not those. Those sports like rugby are not nearly as popular. There's been fewer doping scandals in other sports, and probably the national anti-doping infrastructure is not quite caught up. But I don't think any country, when it comes to cricket, is doing enough, to be honest.
Yeah, for example, India's anti-doping lab lost its WADA accreditation recently. So now, even when with the virus and everything, just getting samples out for testing and getting results back and getting people in labs to do the work, it's a hugely problematic thing. And already, I mean, sets of guidelines are going out from the sports authority and the ministry and stuff like that to try and keep a check on what happens or what athletes get up to in this period. Because you also know now, so the Olympics have been given new dates, right? So
yeah. I mean, it's probably a good time. It's a good time to be a doper now.
Yeah. If you're
less chance of being tested.
One sec, guys. I'm just getting my injection out. One sec, guys.
Yeah. It's that time. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's definitely an interesting time from that point of view.
Then,
Yeah,
then
yeah, yeah.
from
Sorry.
the IPL's perspective, and I'm getting this conversation back to the IPL. What do you suppose they need to be most wary of in this second decade, where they'll probably grow even more as far as broadcast money is concerned, as far as teams are making money is concerned, players making money. What do you suppose they need to be most wary of?
So I guess the biggest risk, perhaps, the IPL is oversupply and saturating the market and diluting the sense that every IPL game is an event, which it still feels like. We have a 60-game season, but you've seen lots of sports leagues and then some T20 leagues. Like the Big Bash used to have that feel of every game being an event, and it's really suffered from overexpansion and it's diluted itself. Although that said, I think there is scope for the IPL to expand to 10 teams, and the quality would still be very high. But it needs to be careful the way it does that. I think it needs to, maintain vigilance about, things like owners, about, fixing on doping as well. But I mean, the IPL is in a great position because you have the rise of the middle class in India, and they love the IPL. They've obviously got more money now than ever before, so that's why the TV ratings are going through the roof, and also the worth of advertising, tickets, etc. Everything. The IPL is in a fantastic position. I actually think it could be much more ambitious in terms of what it does on a global level. So, we're seeing some leagues taking matches abroad. Who's to say the IPL can, maybe play a tournament opener in a different country sometimes, or a final, or whatever. That would be an interesting event. I think we might also see, which would be very interesting, IPL teams, as Kolkata Knight Riders have done with Trinidad in the Caribbean Premier League. We might see more IPL teams basically invest and buy other teams, and that could be really interesting. And what I'd love to see is Indian players be allowed to play abroad. At the moment,
Don't think that's happening
in other T20 leagues, which is actually short-sighted from India's point of view, because India would be a better T20 team if their players had played in the Big Bash. We've got a World Cup there in a few months' time. Indian players have played hardly any T20 in Australia. If lots of them had a season or two there, India would have more chance of winning that tournament. So that is short-sighted from the BCCI. They're actually hampering their national team's chances. And in terms of answering that question we talked about earlier, why have India not been a bit more successful in T20? The lack of overseas experience is a big factor. We've seen Indian players in first-class cricket, go to India, and that's been important in their development. And we've seen India become much better away from home in Test cricket. I think if India will allow their players to go abroad and play in foreign leagues, that would be for the betterment of the Indian team. So that would be a smart move. But as you said, there doesn't seem to be any sign of that coming soon.
We talk about this quite often in the context of football in India, because there the issue is that players aren't being able to develop because they aren't getting enough competitive games in a season. So where in Europe you're playing 40, 50 games a season, here you're getting barely 20, 25 games.
Yeah.
And with cricket, it's I guess in some ways the opposite, because there are that many more talented players in the system who are probably world class or thereabouts, at least first class levels. And there's so many competitions going on all over the world, but yet we're not letting our players go and play it. It's quite an amazing contrast.
Yeah, it is, and it gets to the heart of why you haven't won a World Cup since 2007 in T20. So we saw, I think, from 2012 to 16, the 5 players in the world who played the most T20 games were all from the West Indies. And the West Indies win those 2 World Cups in 2012 and 16. So they have the most experience in all conditions, which is why actually when West Indies play in India, it's almost like they're playing at home. They know those conditions so well. So you see lots of the top West Indies players now will play 40 T20 games a year around the world, and you think of how their skills are developing and how the format's evolving so rapidly. The top Indian players, even with international games, will play 20, 25 games a year, and that's quite a big deficit. It's basically a practice deficit, which is getting bigger with every year, and that is a problem for India. For all the, India obviously has a talent pool unprecedented amongst all the countries in the world. It's, so many people, that the quality of cricket being produced is going through the roof. The quality of domestic players is going through the roof. But I think to get to the next level, being allowed to play abroad would be a massive thing. And India could even say, what would be great if India said, if they identified maybe 5 or 6 players who they said, we're going to be T20 specialists, and we think for Indian cricket, it's better for us if you play in the Big Bash rather than play for India A or whatever. They obviously, players who play in all formats, who are quite few anyway, there's not enough time for them realistically to play in foreign leagues. But for for Washington Sunder, it is better for him to play in the Big Bash and in the T20 Blast than being in India, basically. and India has to recognise that.
And the reverse also, like these guys were chatting about why domestic cricket in India is not, the Ranji Trophy in particular is not so popular, people are not watching and all of that. So one of the suggestions was that they should have a couple of foreign players who are playing in those domestic sides in India, so like an exchange of sorts or whatever, where they will, because to see those players who small town tier 2 India doesn't get to see otherwise, they'll come for that player. It'll help popularize the domestic game, make it more viable, and also give some of these players who want to play in the subcontinent exposure, because I mean then it opens up all kinds of opportunities, I think, for players.
Yeah, it's a fantastic idea. So who's to say India couldn't go to the Big Bash or the T20 or the 100 tournament as it is now and say, you know, we are happy to let 4 or 5 Indian players play in this competition. In exchange, we can let some English or Australian players play in the Ranji Trophy. That would be good. That would be good for everybody, actually. It'd be bad for the other countries that weren't part of that deal. It'd be good for everyone, because if you're, you know, we talked earlier about how lots of foreign leagues have suffered from the lack of Indian players because it means they're not going to get many viewers from India. But if you had half a dozen top Indian players playing in the Big Bash or the T20 or the 100 tournament, we would see viewing figures for that skyrocket. So those leagues, that would be fantastic for those leagues, and it would actually, as I said, it'd be very good for those Indian players being exposed. And yeah, who's to say you couldn't have some you know, foreign players playing in the Ranji Trophy as well? That'd be interesting as well. So yeah, that's what I mean about the IPL and also Indian cricket in the years ahead. I think if it can kind of have a bit more of a globalist mindset, that will actually help it on the field to get to the next level as well.
Final question, Tim. Final two, in fact. One, in the first decade, in which you mentioned in your book as well, and you know, it's pretty obvious that the mercenary player, and I'm terming it the mercenary player, the acceptance of the mercenary player hasn't come a total, right? So there are a few who are accepting it, some are still in transition mode, and some are still going, you are not a cricket player. You know, you're not the purest kind of cricket player.
Michael Holding says to Kieran Pollard famously, which we put in advert.
I love Michael Holding, though. I do love Michael Holding. Love listening to him.
You all love Michael Holding, but
anyway,
but Kieran Pollard now, irony of ironies, he's now the West Indies captain in T20 and ODI cricket.
Exactly. So is that second decade, you reckon, is that going to be the acceptance of the mercenary player?
I think many of us have got there already, where we accept it as a way of life and a fair career choice. But I think in certain countries there's still this snobbery. So we talked with Chris Lynn, the Australian player, and he says, you know, some people still kind of look at me differently because I don't want to wear a baggy green. Moral tinge where it's seen as inferior to embrace T20 ahead of Test cricket. But we see now with young players, I mean, this applies both with Indian players but also other players around the world. So with Tom Banton from England, you know, does Tom Banton need Test cricket? He could have a brilliant career, play the T20 World Cup for England. He could play. He's already got an IPL contract. Play brilliant leagues around the world. I mean, that's a great life. It's a great career. Earned a lot of money. Very fulfilling. Lots of challenges. So does he need Test cricket? So I think that acceptance is there, and it will grow. And people who kind of denigrate the skills or choices of T20 freelance players, they're kind of living in the dark ages. They need to kind of wake up and smell the coffee, really.
And finally, the bumper question. Which format do you see T20 impacting most now? Is it the ODI format or the Test format going forward? I think it's the 50 over.
So I actually think all three formats can coexist together. And one of the interesting things, T20 has led to positive change in the other formats. So obviously you see that in ODI cricket, the scores rising, but we also see that in the structure of the tournament. So the fact we have a new ODI league, we have a new World Test Championship, that kind of comes from pressure that's been put on it from T20 cricket. The fact we have day-night Test cricket, that probably wouldn't have come without T20 cricket. So in some ways, T20 has helped the other formats. And personally, I think all three formats can help together. I think the World Cup in ODI cricket has got its reputation is fantastic, and it's probably the tournament players want to win the most, even more than the T20 World Cup or the IPL. But I think the problem for ODI cricket is, what does it do in those 4 years between tournaments to remain as relevant as possible? And that's where T20 has been a great example for other formats of the game, because the structure of it is very clear to understand. You have a league and you get a winner after 6 months, whereas you have India Sri Lanka ODI series. So what does that really matter? What does it count towards? And that's what other international cricket needs to get better at answering. What does this matter towards? And that's why having leagues that are really easy to understand is going to be a really part of international cricket remaining popular and bringing in bucks, basically.
Annie, you have something to add? So just say
No,
goodbye.
just today the news is. I mean, it's not much news, but like indefinitely postponed the IPL. What's
Yeah.
the sort of reaction there in England among cricketers who were looking to play, as well as from fans that were looking forward to the tournament?
Yeah, you said Sky numbers are huge, right? Sky gets huge numbers on the IPL.
So yeah, and we're actually seeing the numbers for the IPL in England have really grown in recent years, which speaks to the acceptance I talked about. It's also because there's more English players playing. I think this year there's 11 players, so they'll be very very sad they're missing out on their pay packets. But obviously there's a possibility of the tournament being postponed this year. And I think although it's a domestic tournament, its worth to the cricket economy is such that there will be a lot of support for rearranging it, even in a bridge form later in the year. People look at that window in September, October. That's certainly a possibility.
Tim Bigmore, once again, thank you so much for your time, guys. Also, to all the people who are watching the show, do go read that book. Freddie Wild, Tim Bigmore come together to write Cricket 2.0, where they're explaining the evolution of the 2020 game, and a big chunk of that is the IPL. Guys, Tim, could you tell all the people who are watching this, where can they find your book? I found it on my Kindle, so it's pretty easy to buy. I think 600 odd rupees. Anywhere else?
Yeah, so it's available on Amazon India, both on Kindle and to order the hardback copy. So it's out now. And yeah, we think there'll be lots to enjoy for all Indian cricket fans and hopefully some nice distraction during these very peculiar times.
Thank you so much, Tim. Lovely chatting to you.
Thanks, really enjoyed that. Cheers.
Thank you.